Welcome everybody to my driveway. And today in Sidewalk Biological Modeling, we're going to go through the inflammatory response. So when tissue gets damaged or there's some kind of assault to the tissue, the body recognizes that there is a problem and wants to address that problem through a variety of mechanisms that are all entirely chemically mediated. So the first thing that we're going to discuss is just what actually happens to tissue, and that is when it gets broken or cut, or when there's any kind of penetration to that physical barrier. And so when tissue gets broken, there are these cells. They're called mast cells, and mast cells exist all around the body. They exist in areas where the body wants to know if in fact something from the outside has gotten to the tissue. And they exist in some very likely places, like the gastrointestinal tract, the skin, your respiratory epithelial, and of course hair follicles. I know what you're thinking, as well as mucus. So we have these cells, these surveillance cells, that will give off alarms, chemical alarms, that will tell the body that something is happening to bring other elements of the immune system to engage in the fight against a particular problem or pathogen. And so the major generalized chemicals are called cytokines. These are cells that will produce these chemical alarm systems in all sorts of different ways to tell the body to do a variety of different things to fight an infection. And so when we think about the cytokines that are released, we have to begin to think about where the injury is and the kind of cells that are going to produce these different type of chemicals that are going to tell the body to do different types of things in this inflammatory, or I should say defensive and offensive process to protect the body against something that might be problematic to the body. And so I have here what is a pretty basic drawing of a blood vessel. And the blood vessel is surrounded by epithelial cells. And if you remember from class, the internal part that is where you have the inside of the blood vessel is called the intima. And these are endothelial cells. And when there's damaged tissue, these mast cells, as well as tissues that are degraded, will release these chemicals. These chemicals will then stream into the blood vessel around where the injury is. So if it is a localized problem, these chemicals will be secreted in this region and begin to change and the tissue structure of the external part of the cells, which is really pretty fascinating. Through what we discussed is a signal transductive pathway that tells the cell through DNA to produce certain types of proteins that it wouldn't do or produce if these chemical messaging systems didn't tell it to do so. So as we see here, a mast cell, which looks like this, not a great picture of a mast cell, when it's activated, it's going to produce all these chemicals, and these chemicals are as follows. I just have to tell you my joke. Mast cells, ahoy pathogen, meaning we know that you're there and we're going to try to degrade you. Ahoy! So the mast cell, which is granulated, is going to secrete the following cytokines: a histamine, a leukotriene, a prostaglandin, tumor necrotic factor alpha, and interleukin 4 and 13. Now what's interesting about these cytokines is that they are made in different ways, but they also are made with respect to different time factors. So histamine, as you see here, is produced in seconds. Leukotrienes and prostaglandins take hours to produce, and tumor necrotic factor alpha seconds, and interleukin 4 and 13 hours. Now what's interesting is you're going to learn a lot about different cytokines. There are numerous cytokines. These are the ones that we're going to discuss today to try to give you a basic overview of the inflammatory response, but there are a number of them that are really very important, and they all are speaking different languages to the cell to tell it to do different things. They are inducers when we think about what's happening to the cell and what the DNA is told to produce given these different chemicals. So as we move over here from A to B to C, and once again we're looking at an injury, we're looking at the effect that the injury has to the cells and that are alarmist, and the chemicals that are secreted into the bloodstream. We now know what those chemicals are, and so given what those chemicals are, once again, we have histamine, leukotriene, and prostaglandin. Their effect on tissue is really quite profound. So histamines and leukotrienes and prostaglandins, generally speaking, will do the following: increase vascular permeability, meaning things are going to move from the bloodstream into the tissue, which is also known as the interstitial tissue. It's also going to cause smooth muscle constriction, and also chemotaxis attraction. So we're going to discuss that a little bit in greater detail in a moment. So as we move here to D, this is a much larger picture of what you saw in B. This is a blood vessel, one section of a blood vessel. It's a cross section of a blood vessel. And once again, as you notice, the blood vessel is made up of these endothelial cells, and the tissue, or the cells that come in contact with the blood, or I should say the part of the cell that comes in contact with the blood is called the intima. So the blood is made up of, or the blood vessel is made up of endothelial cells. And these cells, of course, are what construct the blood vessels. And if you notice, blood is flowing through one part of the blood vessel to the other. So we know that something's streaming through this. Think of it as a tunnel or a plastic tube where fluid's moving through. In this case, there would be plasma. So what happens is when these cytokines are released from the tissue and they go into the bloodstream, there's going to be all sorts of tissue modeling that there are different things that are going to happen in this situation. So if you notice, what happens here is there are going to be these receptors. The receptors are on the outside of the blood vessel. Here's a receptor, here's a receptor, here's a receptor, and they are going to be specific to those cytokines that are released from the mast cells, as well as some of the cytokines that are released from the cells that have been damaged, that tell the body there has been a problem. So if you notice, histamine, prostaglandins, and leukotrienes are all attracted to these receptors. They're very specific to these receptors. And when these particular chemicals dock onto these receptors, there's going to be all this tissue or cellular structural changes that occur. They're not major, they're just the kind of changes that occur to help the body attract and draw those immune cells to a particular part of the body where there's a problem. So what happens here is the histamines, prostaglandins, and leukotrienes in general have a really interesting effect. Prior to this, the blood vessel looked like this. Notice it was smooth and there was nothing that was extending outward. When histamines, prostaglandins, and leukotrienes dock onto those receptors, they create or produce a protein called a P-selectin. It's this kind of three-dimensional protein that looks kind of like a fork. These selectins, these P-selectins, what they're designed to do is to attract and capture monocytes and neutrophils. And if you notice, here is this, by the way, is a monocyte, an immature macrophage coming from the bone. And here's a neutrophil. Notice it's multinucleated or polynucleated. And they have these receptors that are going to connect with these receptors. So these receptors on these white blood cells are going to connect to the P-selectin, so that they know, or they'll attach to the blood vessel so that they can begin to engage or know exactly where to fight. So as you see here, these selectins will connect with the receptors from the white blood cells, and once they connect, the other thing that happens is they will start to move from the blood into the region where there is a injury or where there is a pathogen that they need to engage. Now, the only way to get there is through a process called increased permeability. And one of the interesting things about histamine, prostaglandins, and leukotrienes is not only do they help force the cell to make these proteins, but they also create these gaps between the endothelial cells, these spaces that make these blood vessels permeable to or allowing fluid from moving from here to here. So when we talk about increased permeability, the cell is becoming more permeable, allowing fluid from the blood vessel to move into the interstitial tissue where the injury is. Notice there are no spaces here. There are spaces here, and these spaces are caused by the structural instructions that are telling these endothelial cells to contract and make these spaces. So then what you get here is you get these cells that will squeeze through the blood vessel and begin to go into tissue and engage in a fight. Now when that happens, you can sort of know that inflammation generally causes swelling. Well, fluid's going to be moving from here to here, so there's going to be a lot of swelling in tissue because the plasma is going to leak into that interstitial space. That's called edema, and that's not a girl's name. So, you know, if you know someone whose name is edema, tell her to get it changed. So, when there is edema, there's going to be swelling. When there is swelling, there's going to be pain. Now, what's interesting about pain is prostaglandins and bradykinin, which is over here, another cytokine usually released due to the discretion of phospholipids on cells, is going to activate pain receptors. But the swelling is going to be more conducive to that kind of pain stimulation. So as we move from D, and you recognize that the cells of the immune system are going to leak into this process, into this space. We're going to talk a little bit more about what actually is going on here and some of the terminology.